Thanks very much. Well, I can't offer an election spiel because I'm not running, and if I was, it would be somewhere where you couldn't vote. I did once run as an independent candidate for my ward in my local council, and there were 3 positions and I came 4th. So that was the end of my political career, so I've had to retire to academia. Thanks very much for the chance to talk to you about smart transport. I've started off just by thinking about what we mean when we use terms like smart. I think what we're probably implying is that there are some smart ways of doing things and others that can be more pejoratively described. Now, I'll try and be as polite and academically objective as I can, so that will be my last reference to anything being dumb. But I think perhaps it's important for us to understand that there is a gradation of smartness, if you like. There are better ways of doing things and worse ways of doing things, and then there are often even better ways of doing things than the ways that we think might be doing all right. So what I'm really trying to look at is, and this is how my research operates as well, is how those of us that are not in fact at the top of the tree in terms of best practice, smartness, whatever you care to call it, can improve. And one of the ways, it seems to me, in which we can do that is to see what the people that are beating us are doing. Now, that's actually a relatively unusual thing to find in transport planning, because what tends to happen is we all live in a particular country or a city, we get used to things operating the way they are, we assume there's something natural about the way we do things, and so we find it difficult to imagine change. But we do have to imagine change. You've already heard why. I'm certainly not going to spend hours and hours going on about the reasons why we need smart transport, because even though it's the title of my talk, you all know about climate change. Gee, that went well. Oh, I have to turn it on. See, I'm a transport planner, but not a on switch. It's all right. Oh, it's vibrating. That's exciting. There we go. We all know about climate change. I think that's supposed to be a toboggan there. We've all heard about peak oil, and I've even heard people cope with another sleeper issue in transport that we're slowly becoming aware of. We tend to worry about our school kids getting fat because they're driven everywhere by their fat parents who drive everywhere, but it's really a society-wide issue. Now, for all those reasons and many others, I think the people who are ahead of the game, the countries that are ahead of the game, the cities that are ahead of the game, realise that the era in which transport movement patterns and transport policies can be completely dominated by the automobile are over. And increasingly this is being reflected in government policy, to some extent in Australia, but much more so I think in Europe and parts of North America. It doesn't really seem to be on the agenda here. I think I've already heard some reference to this document, and many of you know it better than I do, but don't try and assimilate this whole table in one go. But I did find it very eloquent when I compared new and improved infrastructure for highways, new and improved infrastructure for roads, with public transport infrastructure. And I note that this year the ratio is 20 to 1. However, 10 years from now the ratio is 70 to 1. So that doesn't suggest to me that current policy on a nationwide basis in New Zealand is taking things like climate change, peak oil, obesity and all the other reasons for policy change seriously. Now, the argument, as I understand it, for an investment pattern like this is that apparently New Zealand wants economic growth. I was here 2 years ago at a conference that was opened by the current Transport Minister, and he gave a speech in which he started off talking about how apparently all young New Zealanders are immigrating to Australia, and this was the result of low economic growth, and this was the result of the fact that Auckland didn't have enough motorways. Now, I do in fact meet a lot of Kiwis in Australia, and so ever since then I've always asked them why they left New Zealand and came to Australia, and not one of them has ever told me it was because Auckland didn't have enough motorways, although quite a few of them will volunteer the fact that Auckland's terrible public transport was a factor in them deciding to try and live somewhere else where they didn't need to drive everywhere. But let's assume for a moment that economic growth is your priority objective, and I'm not sure that it ought to overwhelm considerations like the environment and human health, but it is important, no doubt about it. Well, the kind of lazy approach I'd adopt is to say, well, can we think of anywhere that's doing well on the whole economic growth caper that we might be able to get some advice from? I do know that there are countries where the transport investment patterns look like that. I have a colleague, Dr Imran Mohammed, who's up at Palmerston North at Massey University, who's an expert on transport policy in his home country of Pakistan, and Pakistan has a transport investment profile that looks a bit like that, but I rather imagine that it's probably not the model that New Zealanders have in mind. So I thought, can we think of any kind of smallish mountainous countries where the economy is kicking a lot of goals? Now, poor old Switzerland, they have suffered a lot in the global financial crisis. Unemployment has ballooned to 2.8%, but on the whole, if you want to be economically prosperous in a country without vast amounts of mineral resources to dig up, you could do a lot worse than look at what they're doing. Now, interestingly enough, their population's just under twice New Zealand's, but their GDP is 4 times New Zealand's, so they must be doing something right. So let's have a look at their transport investment split. In English, you'll notice, but published by the Swiss Federal Statistical Office, and they, of course, have 3 levels of government, but I guess you could take the cantons as a substitute for your regions. Now, you probably can't translate this into relative to GDP, but if you look at the total national government spend on transport, it's about a quarter less as a proportion of GDP than in New Zealand. So the Swiss national government, and I think in fact, even if you count local government, the Swiss national government spends less on transport than New Zealand does. Yeah, they obviously must be spending money on something else, and I have no idea what everything else that they're spending money on instead is, but if you compare university fees and the quality of higher education across the 2 countries, you'll get at least part of the answer to where the rest of the money in Switzerland is going. But you'll notice the difference, you see. The majority of the money, about 60%, is going on public transport, and a minority goes on roads. Local councils, of course, spend a lot on roads, as they do here, because they've got to maintain them and so on. The states don't seem to spend much on anything, but the national government spends most of its money on public transport. So, relative to New Zealand, as a percentage of GDP, this is less than half the New Zealand figure, and this is 40 times the New Zealand figure, and that's including operating subsidies as well as capital. So this is what the country that's kicking the most goals economically is doing, and there is an argument, I would have thought, that if you're really serious about economic growth, and needless to say, they're protecting themselves against peak oil and climate change by doing that as well, you could do a lot worse than follow the example of the people that are winning. However, it's often said, well, these Swiss, they're different from us, aren't they? They eat those chocolates out of those tins with pictures on them, and they've got William Tell and stuff. And whereas in New Zealand, we all know that New Zealanders have a love affair with the car, and therefore there's no point trying to improve public transport because they won't use it. But here's a strange thing. There hasn't actually been, by international standards, much done to improve public transport in New Zealand, but as somebody that did actually take a train from the old Auckland railway station before Britomart, possibly something that very few Aucklanders ever did, and if they did, I wondered why they would, because it was a horrendous environment. Even the very, very modest improvements to Auckland's rail system have created an enormous increase in patronage, and let's face it, if road traffic in Auckland had gone like that, you wouldn't be able to move at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I'm not completely convinced that the argument that people don't respond if you improve public transport applies. But then again, they say, well, 9 million passengers a year, that's not actually very many. So maybe that should be the limit of our ambition and we can go to sleep. But if you compare Auckland to a couple of other cities that are in fact not all that different, Perth and Vancouver, sprawly, low-density cities like New Zealand cities. In fact, both Vancouver and Perth are less dense than Auckland. Then what you find is that there's plenty of room for improvement. Vancouver, it should be pointed out, had no rail passengers at all in 1980 because they hadn't opened any rail lines yet. So there does seem to be a lot of scope for improvement. So it's not immediately obvious to me that the arguments in favour of spending all the money on motorways and next to nothing on public transport are very strong. One of the things that I find interesting is that local government, which, whatever else you might say about it, tends to be more grassroots and tends to be more inclined to listen to its community. Local governments are in fact much keener on changing transport policies than the national government. And this is the case in just about every country in the world, but it's particularly extreme in New Zealand. So here's a little sketch from the recently released plan for the reconstruction of Christchurch. But there's good aspects and bad aspects about this. The good aspect is that the council has listened to its community, and the community is saying we really need some decent public transport options. And so the council urban designers have looked at some groovy overseas light rail systems and drawn some pictures of what it might look like if it was introduced in Christchurch, and that particularly urban design award-winning kind of thing. And in fact, the real one in Strasbourg has already won urban design awards. Now, that's all fantastic. But one of the you don't just need money, unfortunately, and I think one of the things that the starting of the planning for Christchurch shows is that if we're going to bring about policy change, it's not just a matter of shifting the funding. It's a matter of changing organisational structures. It's also about skill bases. Let's face it, if you were a world-beating quality public transport planner in New Zealand, until very recently, you would have starved to death. So, by definition, they're all dead from starvation or they've immigrated. So, what we need is not just more money, but we also need to upgrade the skill base, because although it's a little bit hard to tell, there is a substantial difference between the way Strasbourg have done this and the way Christchurch envisages doing this. Let me show you something less boring. Here is the map showing Homme de Fer, which is the square with the fancy architecture. And as you can see, all major public transport lines in Strasbourg intersect at this point, which is why they built the fancy roof thing to, doesn't actually keep the rain off, but it says, hello, this is the major junction. Now, unfortunately, with the very best of intentions, the plan for Christchurch, and it's a little hard to read, is in fact to deviate all the bus services around the centre of town so that everyone will have to get off and walk, and no one will be able to make a convenient transfer from one direction to the other, and the bus services themselves will take a lot longer to get from one side of town to the other than if they went straight through. So even when we're trying to do the right thing, we need to do more than just say, light rail is fantastic, give us money for it. We also need to upgrade our planning skills. But I'd suggest we need to go further as well, because Strasbourg is in fact a very impressive example of a very small city that managed to get an awful lot of people just on its tram system alone. Now, that's the annual public transport patronage across the whole of Auckland by all modes, buses, ferries, the whole caboodle, and yet they get it out of 272,000 people. Now, that's pretty impressive. But on the other hand, if you really want to go to the top of the class, you go to Zurich, where they use trams at more than twice the rate, but pay much lower subsidies. And subsidies are very important, you see, because the Strasbourg system is run by a private company who will sniff out the fact that Christchurch is interested in light rail and offer to build this thing for them at 5 times the gross domestic product of New Zealand for the next 100 years. But maybe you can't afford it, you see. So maybe we actually need to learn from the very best in the class. Now, let me give you a further example. Here is the mode split, forgot to put the heading in, how travel is organised by different modes of transport in the two cities. Now, these figures are 10 years old. It's better than that in Strasbourg, and that beats the living daylights out of every New Zealand city, but the car is still the biggest mode. You'll notice they got it down to half, but in Zurich it's heading down to a quarter, and it is the richest city in the world, so they're not doing it because they're too poor to drive. And the main difference is public transport. Unfortunately, I couldn't get separate figures for bikes for New Zealand, for Zurich. So, although I think we can be inspired by the French, if we really want to start planning for genuine success and to be the smartest in the class, we ought to compare ourselves against the very best in the world. So, some of you, I'm sure, have been to Zurich. Very pretty. This is the city of Zurich. There are suburbs and rural areas as well, but the thing I really want to direct your attention to is, you see this? I didn't actually realise this when I bought this postcard. She must have just magnetically attracted itself to me. You see this long traffic jam here along the main road, along the quay, and you see it goes all the way around the corner as well. Now, here's a truly extraordinary thing. The richest city in the world, there's a dirty big traffic jam. Now, their economy, of course, should have collapsed by now, because as we know, if anyone in a road vehicle ever has to slow down, the economy shuts down. But funnily enough, it doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, the other thing that you may not notice, and it's a shame that they didn't include it in the photo, is the reason why there's a traffic jam is because the second lane is reserved for trams. There's probably one behind this building because they come every minute or two, so it would have been a perfect photo if they had the tram as well. And so the reason why it doesn't matter that these people in cars are in a traffic jam is because only a quarter of travel across the whole city of Zurich is by car, and the figure for the very centre is less than 10%, so this is just a small antisocial minority of the population, so who cares? If they choose to sit in a traffic jam while the trams pass them, that's their lookout, really. Now, The interesting thing about Zurich as well is that their subsidy levels are much lower than most of the French public transport systems. In fact, the Zurich tram system carries more passengers than all the tram systems of France combined, but it receives a smaller annual subsidy than any of them. So they must be doing something right. Had a lot of very smart people living in Zurich over the years. That might have something to do with it, but you know, they've also had a few ratbags living in Zurich. This was where this gentleman was until the Germans spirited him off to foment revolution in the Soviet Union. Now, funnily enough, this fellow may have inadvertently influenced their transport policy, because here is just a picture of a major transport interchange in inner city Zurich. 100 million public transport passengers pass through this interchange every year, which is more than use all forms of public transport in New Zealand combined. Single interchange. But every single public transport object or entity that you see in that picture is owned and operated either by the City Council or by the State Transport Agency, which goes under the delightful name of the Zuricher Verkehrsverbund, which is kind of funny because in spite of this gentleman living there, they're actually quite keen on the free enterprise system in Zurich. It's just that they don't think that it should play much of a role in public transport. They do think that it does have a role, and here it is, that guy that runs the newspaper stand is a private business. But everything else is run by a public agency. Now, of course, if you say that in New Zealand, people think you're a ratbag, because, as we know, countries that have socialist operated public enterprises go to hell in a handbasket. It's inefficient and no one uses it, and it causes an economic loss, and the country goes down the drain economically. But funnily enough, they're quite old-fashioned about this kind of stuff. But of course, what they've done is created very efficient public sector agencies that provide a service that's so good that even the inhabitants of the richest city in the world are perfectly happy to use it in preference for their cars. Here's another thing though. Let's look at a bit of close-up. They didn't win any Urban Design Award for those trams because they're 40 years old. I in fact remember one of the French carpet-bagging firms trying to flog Melbourne some Strasbourg-style interchanges in return, of course, for Strasbourg-level subsidies, and alas, they were successful. And so I unkindly at this seminar said, but shouldn't we be looking to the most successful tram systems in the world, like in Zurich? And he said, they have very old trams in Zurich. Well, they do, you see. But they didn't become the richest city in the world by chucking stuff out that still worked. So, the other thing is, again, contra some of the recent proposals both for buses in Auckland and also for buses and possibly rail in Christchurch, this is the very centre of town. The trams go right down the main street, and it never occurs to anyone that that in any way oppresses pedestrians. Well, so there's your answer, right? Light rail. Put trams in, all your problems go away. Well, unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. Let me show you some very boring census data. This is how Australians have got to work over the last 30 years. We don't have the results from last week's census yet, so this is 76 to 06. And as you can see, we haven't really necessarily done all that brilliantly. Train patronage stable in Sydney, dead cat bounce in Melbourne, dead cat still on the floor in Brisbane, competing with Auckland in Adelaide, and losing now, I think, as of this year. And in Perth doing quite well, and in fact they've opened a new rail line in Perth, and this year's census will show them up around here ahead of Brisbane. That's trains, fantastic. If you then look at trams and buses, which basically means buses everywhere except Melbourne, you'll see who the worst performer is. Melbourne, the place that's got trams, and we're now at the bottom of the table. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, that we shouldn't have light rail, but that if we really want to have smart transport and be the best in the world, we have to be a bit more sophisticated. We have to be prepared to burrow down to find out what it is over and above a particular form of technology they've done right. So let me show you something else boring, much less pretty than tram shelters in Strasbourg. This is the public transport map of Zurich. Tram lines in colour, bus lines in blue. Now, if you look very carefully, you'll see that there are an awful lot more bus lines than there are tram lines. And what this in fact is a rail bus system. The two modes interact effortlessly with each other. Frequently you can step off the bus, take 3 steps and step on the tram because they stop on the opposite sides of the same platform. That was why the bus in that previous photo was heading in the wrong direction, so people could get off the side. That meant that they could transfer more easily. And There are no buses, you'll notice, in the centre of town because everyone has to get off and transfer to a train or a tram line. You compare that, for example, with the centre of Auckland, where a bus system that carries a quarter as many passengers every day as the Zurich tram system manages to jam the central city with parked and moving buses for an hour or two in the morning and an hour or two in the afternoon. So this is an example of what I call the network effect. But just before we get to explain the details of the network effect, let me also show you how efficient these dudes are. Here's something even more boring than a map, the organisational chart for the Zuricher Verkehrsverbund, the cantonal public transport authority for the state or canton of Zurich, which has about the same population as Auckland, about 1.4 million people, but carries literally 10 times as many public transport passengers every year as the Auckland public transport system does. And I have argued that this is an application of something that a Swiss transport planner called, and I stole the name and so people think I invented it, the network planning approach to public transport. And basically the idea is to move from individual bits and pieces of things, where you might have a couple of routes in an individual city that provide a half decent level of service, but unless you live along them and are travelling to somewhere along that route, forget about it. Or alternatively, you might have, say, in Christchurch before the earthquake, a couple of decent radial bus routes and one circumferential one that they call the orbiter, to something where all the different parts of the system operate at high service standards, common service standards, so they can interlock and you can go anywhere to anywhere, anytime you want to, because let's face it, that's what the car gives you. So providing that with public transport, it seems to me, is the top of the class. And it enables you to produce efficiencies in operations and even in bureaucratisation if you're able to do it in a cunning enough way that enable you to provide an enormous amount more bang for your buck than we generally find in less well-planned public transport systems. And you don't have to be Swiss to do it, and you don't have to be pretty. So here's a photo of something really ugly, and I've kept the thing there so you can see who I stole it from and where it comes from. This is the busiest station in the Perth suburban rail system. It now carries about as many passengers a day in this single station as the entire Auckland rail system. But a couple of years ago when it opened, it carried about 13,000 two-way trips a day. But look what Murdoch it's called, look what I'm trying to point to is these figures here. You notice 59% of them get to the station by bus. In fact, it's 2/3 now because they've run out of park and ride spaces. Here's the park and ride lot, and yet the little bus terminal there is worth twice as many passengers a day. So even the Western Australians are learning the network principles, and trust me, they're no smarter than the rest of us Australians, so therefore by definition they can't be smarter than New Zealand's, because I'm still old enough to remember Piggy Muldoon's comment about the average intelligence of both countries increasing when certain trans-Tasman movements occur. Now, here's Murdoch Station on their fancy new rail line to Mandurah that opened about 3 years ago. Now, anyone who gets a chance should have a look at this because this really is state-of-the-art rail engineering, but it's also state-of-the-art network planning. This line is 72 kilometres long. It includes a tunnel under the central business district and 2 underground stations. This was actually the easy bit to build down the middle of the freeway, but they did have to squash the freeway back to either side in order to fit things like the stations in. This cost $17 million a kilometre and took 3.5 years to build. So when people tell you that rail should be fantastically expensive and should take decades, don't believe them, because with the right organisational culture and skill base in place, it can be a lot cheaper. So we've just taken our train down here. The Mandurah train service averages 90 kilometres an hour. That's not its top speed, that's the average speed including all the stops at the stations. It does 130 k's between stations, so you get to pass all the cars on the freeway, even at quiet times when they're doing 100 k's, which is kind of fun. You feel like a winner when you use public transport in this part of Perth at least. So, we get off at the rather nicely designed station, we get on the escalators, we get to the escalator top, and blow me down, there's the bus. Right at the top of the escalators. The simplest concept you can imagine, but can you get that anywhere else in Australia? I don't think so. Can we get that yet in New Zealand? Not quite. Usually Suburban Designer will have put something that won an award in the middle, so you have to walk 1/4 mile to get to the bus and get rained on as well. The buses then go off on their own separate roadway that they're given with traffic signal priority so that they're not held up by calling in and out of the traffic on the main road, and there's even reasonably decent customer information about where you're going, and so all the routes going to the local university leave from the same spot. So they can even do it in Perth. Now, That brings us, of course, to the last reason why it's supposed to be impossible, and in some ways the most popular, because everyone I speak to in New Zealand tells me, oh yes, but you need incredibly high population densities to make public transport work. Auckland's a really spread out, sprawly city. To which my response is, you obviously haven't been to Perth if you think that, because Auckland is a compact, almost European-style city relative to Perth. In fact, Peter Newman, a Perth-based academic who measures this stuff, has collated figures which suggest that Auckland's population density of the urbanised part of Auckland, not including the paddocks and the farms, is about the same as Sydney's, and much higher than Perth's, and in fact higher than Melbourne's. And Greater Wellington's density is actually higher than any city in Australia, because regional councils were better at controlling really, really low density fringe growth than in Australia. But nevertheless, everyone, whether it be in Australia or New Zealand, believes that density is an insuperable barrier to fixing public transport. They believe it in my hometown. You know, Melbourne only has 14.9 people per hectare, whereas Toronto and Montreal have 3 or 4 times as many figures as we do. Funnily enough, in Victoria, government planning agencies don't feel obliged to reference their figures, but they get them from the work of Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy, who've collated all this data from all these cities. Unfortunately, they left New Zealand out, which is a bit of a shame because it's a very pretty diagram. But if you include the New Zealand figures, they'd be in there with the Australian cities, only towards the densest end, in terms of how far out you are from the x-axis. Now, a lot of people looked at this and thought, well, what this proves you is that density explains everything. See down here, Hong Kong, very dense, very low usage of automobiles. Sacramento, very undense, very high usage of automobiles. But here's the funny thing. The average density of the American cities is the same as the average density of the Australian cities. You can kind of see that if you see how far out from the left axis they are. But the automobile usage is twice as high. Now, if New Zealand was on this map, it'd be here, but with a bullet heading towards here, because if you spend $15 billion on motorways over the next 10 years, that'll be the easiest way of getting you up to the top of the table. So density has an influence, but it's not the only influence. In fact, if you actually examine things more closely, what we often find is that people don't always measure density consistently. So this is how Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy measured the density of my hometown, Melbourne. This blob shows the urbanised area. You divide it into the population, you get X number of people per hectare. Fine. Here is how they came up with a much higher figure for Toronto. Now, how about that for an urban growth boundary? Isn't that incredible? Absolutely nothing. And it just finishes in a straight line like that. It's quite extraordinary. Well, the reason for that is because this is the city of Toronto, and there's another Toronto on the other side of it, which takes up about 5 times as much room, and they couldn't get data for it, so they left it out. Now, this is not a cheap shot at Newman and Kenworthy, who are collecting figures for millions of cities, but what it shows you is that you have to be very careful when you're measuring density. A point made many years ago by this gentleman, who was in fact the first lecturer in town planning at RMIT, where I now work. He was actually got a doctorate in town planning in Vienna, but he was a bit too Jewish for his own good in 1938 when the Nazis moved in. So he went for a ski trip to Innsbruck and kept skiing until he got to Switzerland, and here's where he landed. And basically then kept skiing until he arrived in Australia, although there was water skiing by that stage, where he wrote a book in 1946 called X-Ray the City. And basically it's about how to measure population density correctly, funnily enough. The first town planning book ever published in Australia. Now, in this book, and I should have copied this as well, there's a wonderful table that he produced. Chris Harris, who I believe is talking later, knows at least as much about this as I do, that was basically headed, if you don't measure density correctly, you can get silly and inconsistent results, and there follows a list of silly and inconsistent results. The authors of Auckland's 1955 motorway plan took Fuchs's table of silly densities, took off the heading saying silly densities don't take seriously, and included it in the very first report arguing for motorways saying, see, this table shows that Auckland has the lowest density in the known universe and that therefore there's no alternative to motorways. Now that was 1955, and we're still hearing the argument today, and it's no more valid than it was then. As it turns out, census agencies, not here alas, but in Australia, the US and Canada, did listen to Fuchs and his colleagues, so here's Statistics Canada's measurement of the urban area of Toronto, which is 5 times the size of the one that you saw before. Now, since the Canadian, US and Australian census agencies all measure densities like this, and they also ask you how to get to work in the census, it's possible to do a league table across the 3 countries comparing public transport use and density across the 50 major cities. And I've arranged them in order from most to least dense, and you can't read it because the writing's too small, so let's zero in on the top of the table and look who's number 1. I know this is hard to believe, but that's all of Los Angeles, you see, 16 million of them. Los Angeles, in fact, has the highest density of any city across the three nations. And it hasn't helped them very much on public transport use. These figures from the 2000 census, and interestingly enough, Auckland's figure was exactly the same. Since Los Angelinos use public transport more for non-work trips than Auckland residents do, the overall usage rate was slightly lower in Auckland than LA, and it's not to do with density. You see, Toronto and Los Angeles have the same density, but enormously differing public transport usage rates. The most sustainable city is actually Ottawa down here, which has the highest rate of walking, cycling and public transport combined. If you go right down to the bottom of the table, you see Brisbane, only 9 people per hectare, less than half as dense as Auckland, but blow me down. Slightly less automobile dependent than Melbourne, with the same public transport usage, 14% or 2.5 times the rate that Auckland was getting at the same time. So I'm not suggesting that density's got nothing to do with it, or that we shouldn't try and plan for compact cities, but we certainly shouldn't be using it as an excuse for the lack of progress. All right, that's a bit boring. Time for some pictures. Oh, but before we do the pictures, in order to understand why. I could talk to you in great detail about how things work in Zurich, but Auckland isn't the only city or town in New Zealand, and I know there are people here from places that are quite small. Some of them, in fact, almost as small as this little Swiss town called Schaffhausen. Someone was telling me that Hungary has 50,000 people. So let's have a look at a little town of 44,000 people and see how they operate public transport. Because if you look at their public transport trip rate per year, it's 5 times as high as Auckland. If you look at the share of people that take public transport to work, it's 6 times as high as in Auckland, and they walk and cycle a bit too. Yet if you look at the subsidy per passenger, it's as cheap as dirt, even allowing for the fact that a Swiss franc is worth about $300 on the current exchange rate, because they're the only currency in Europe that anyone thinks is safe. So if you can make public transport work here, then anywhere in New Zealand with more than 3 people and a dog living in it should be a pushover. How do they do it? Here's a map. Now, did anyone recognise that map? Anyone seen something that looks like that map before? That's the London Underground map, isn't it? Or the Paris Metro map. What they've done is they've made their little small municipal bus service look like the London Underground or the Paris Metro. Now, what they're saying is, even though we're so small, we've only got buses, we will give you a service so good that you'll think it's rail. And they'll do it. They do it with only 6 routes, all of which travel from somewhere to somewhere else via the Bahnhof. And apropos of people who say that in small towns we should be running small buses because we can't get enough people to fill a regular sized bus, here you'll see is a dirty big articulated bus, because the first 2 routes, the busiest ones, are run by articulated buses because they can't fit people on otherwise. How do they do that, I hear you ask, hopefully? Well, you have to look at the timetable, because that holds the key. So here's the timetable for route number 3, but it could be any timetable because they're all exactly the same. As long as you understand that means every 10 minutes, then you understand the timetable, because from the crack of dawn until 8 p.m, this route runs every 10 minutes. And you'll notice that it waits a couple of minutes at the station and then leaves at 10, 20, 30, blah, 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 past the hour. Alas, because it's a country town, things get quiet after 8 p.m, so you get a 20-minute service until midnight, but also 20, 40 and so on past the hour. Why do they leave it exactly that time past the hour? Well, the answer is because Swiss people are very impatient and they won't wait 10 minutes for a bus, so you have to make it easy for them to remember the timetable. Now, I've got to be careful here because I'm running out of time. Now, they do the same thing on Saturdays, although the 10-minute service starts later. Same thing on Sundays, doesn't start till the afternoon, but still runs until midnight. They have an after-midnight service on Friday and Saturday. I won't bother with the fare system. But let's just say they don't have smart cards and fancy things like that because they'd rather spend the money on services. The other thing the timetable enables them to do is to do this at the Bahnhof, the main railway station here on the left. Here it is at 5 minutes past the hour. And here it is at 10 past the hour. 6 buses, pedestrian crossing at either end. They wait there for 2 minutes. You can transfer from anywhere to anywhere. So once you're on your own bus, you don't need a timetable because you can go anywhere in Schaffhausen by transferring like this. 20 past, 20 past, 25. Anyway, you get the idea. Almost finished. Let me give you the extreme case. A place so low density that if you can make public transport work here, even small towns are a pushover. Here is the Swiss district of Inn, also known as the Lower Engadine. It's the same size as metropolitan Auckland's urbanised area, like the purple bit on that map of Melbourne, and it has 9,000 residents. So it should be impossible, right? Here's a map of it. you'll note that they have 2 railway lines serving 9,000 people, both ending at the Big Smoke, Skawal, population 2,000. But I want us to go up the hill to Terrasp, which is a small village which by now should appear to be familiar. And let's have a look at the results from the last Swiss census on how they get to work and school. Now, I should have included Auckland, but I can't get the density figures, so I've compared them with my hometown and a British city with a very high density of 40 people per hectare. But you'll notice that they're much less car dominated. Now, they're a small village, so a lot of people work locally, so they can walk, but you'll notice that the public transport use is higher than in either the British city or in Melbourne. And for trips to school, well, I don't think they have to worry about fat kids, because there wasn't a single kid that was driven to school at the last census, because they have a question about it. And they're split roughly evenly between car and public transport. Oh, yes, but you know, they're Swiss. It's always been like that, hasn't it? Well, actually, no, because if you compare them to the previous census, they were doing much better than us, but they still had a lot more car use than they got in the last 10 years. Now, this is a region, as I say, with 9,000 people spread over X hundred square kilometres, and even they weren't prepared to let someone tell them that their density was too low for first-rate, viable public transport. And remember, this is the richest country in the world, so they haven't bankrupted themselves by doing this. I'll finish on the next couple of slides, but here's their local public transport network for 9,000 people. These are the town buses for the town of 2,000 people. These are the little ones that connect remoter settlements up to the rail line. Here's the one that goes to Terrasp, which we've been looking at pretty pictures of. So how does the timetable work? You only get a train an hour because it's a remote rural area, but they all leave at the same time, you see, so people can remember them. And they only run until 10:15 because it's rural and everyone goes to bed. Then when they get to the other end, this time they do have small buses, because for a village of 300 people, they can't fill a big bus, so as long as they never have to fill a big bus, they can have a small bus. But you see William Tell's horn there? It's run by the Swiss Post Office. They're such socialists that even buses here are controlled by a public agency. Actually, the dude who drives the bus as a private business. He's a subcontractor to the Swiss Post Office, who in turn contract to the Regional Public Transport Authority for the Canton of Graubünden, which has 3 staff. It's horses for courses, you see. Here's the bus timetable. It's a bit hard to read, but you'll see in peak hour there's a service every half hour. At other times there's one every hour. They meet with the train up until the last train. The late night one, the evening one's a taxi, so you can't take your bike on them. And on Friday and Saturday night, they've got an extra one a little bit before midnight. I don't know what it is that they're coming home from at that time of night with a village of 2,000, but I'm sure they feel very bucolic when they get back to that. So, my argument is that if smart transport is a meaningful concept, then these people have cracked the nut. I'm not suggesting that we should be slavishly copying them, either in Australia or in New Zealand, but there are plenty of areas of New Zealand that are more suitable to the provision of efficient public transport than this. Small towns in New Zealand are more suitable than this. Large provincial cities are, and Auckland, Christchurch and Wellington most certainly are. So my closing message to you really is, I don't think I need to convince this audience that smart transport, or whatever you call it, is desirable, but it's also practical, achievable and affordable, providing that you have the right policies, the right organisational arrangements and the right political and organisational culture in place. Thanks very much for your time.
So we've got a few minutes for questions. We've got a couple of roving microphones so everyone can hear the question. So just put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll get a mic to you so everyone can hear it.
How do we get around this resistance to change that we have here in New Zealand, where people don't like getting off a bus and onto a train onto another bus?
Did you guys hear that? You could repeat it, so just so everyone can hear it over the corner.
How do we get around this resistance to change that we have in New Zealand, where people don't like getting off a bus and onto a train and onto another bus? There seems to be quite a resistance here.
Well, the resistance to doing that here is perfectly rational, because if you do it in Auckland, they not only charge you an extra fare to add insult to injury, but you can usually guarantee that the interchange facilities aren't attractive, the timetable won't be coordinated, and the bus company is really sending you the message, stay on our bus because we'll actually take you all the way into town along the motorway, and although it'll take longer than the train because we're caught in the traffic jam on the motorway, it won't take longer than the train because you would have spent half an hour at the railway station getting rained on waiting for the train to turn up. So I don't think it's a cultural thing. I think people respond rationally to what they're offered. Swiss people wouldn't put up with those kinds of things as well. There's a suburban interchange point in Schaffhausen that I didn't show you, and they actually have the timetable that shows you that the timed connection is 1 minute. And on the rare occasions when one bus is late, the other one waits for it. But the connection is 1 minute because, you know, if it was 2 minutes, people would start to grumble, and if it was 3 minutes, they wouldn't transfer. So the evidence is very strong. Perth is a particularly good case because their rail lines did replace direct bus services that went into the central city along the motorway services, and everyone said the same thing, oh, it won't work, blah, 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 blah. All these economists proved it with mathematical models that it wouldn't work, and sure enough, the only thing that happened when they opened the train lines is that they'd underestimated the patronage and had to rush out and order for new trains.
Thank you. Could you please comment on the use of public transport by cyclists?
I think that's something that depends very much on the kind of terroir, shall we say, if we were wine critics. I've noticed that when you look at census data on how people travel in Switzerland, in general, the combined total for walking and cycling is usually the same everywhere. But if it's flat, it's split 50-50 between walking and cycling. If it's mountainous, like up the top of the hill there, then it's all walking and next to no cycling. So I think cycling is kind of like, it's optional, but I don't mean that in a bad way, if that makes sense. It does seem to depend very much on things like terrain. One of the things that we rather like the idea of in Australia is making it easy for people to take their bikes with them on regular public transport vehicles. If you actually think about that, if people started doing that in great numbers, it would be a catastrophe, because a trainload of people would need 3 more trains just to carry their bikes, and that means it's not very greenhouse efficient and it's not a very efficient usage of capacity. You certainly need to make it easier for people to get to and from stops by bike, but in a good public transport system you don't need a bike at the other end because there's a connection waiting for you at the other end. The reason why they like carrying bikes in rural Canton Graubünden is because people go for recreational cycling up in the mountains and so on, and that should certainly be encouraged. But for somewhere like Auckland, people shouldn't need to bring their bike with them on the bus or the train because they should have convenient access at the other end. But as a means of getting them from their home to the station, it's something we should be encouraging, because you can build 50 bike spaces for the price of 1 car space at the railway station. But I think we should be aiming to have people leave their bikes at the station and then transport themselves via their feet from there on.
Time for 2 more questions. Murray, down the middle.
Paul, I take an implication from what you're saying that I take an implication from what you're saying that the key to a successful public transport system is proper integrated timetable and fare system, which involves painless transfer. The implication is that the nature of the vehicle, the technology, doesn't matter. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's probably right. I wouldn't go too far on that. I think there are laws of economies of scale that suggest that for certain volumes of patronage you have to move to higher capacity modes, rail-based modes of one kind or another. But I think the central feature that makes all this work isn't primarily technological, because Swiss trains don't look that much different from trains here, well, except that they're better looked after and cleaner and so on. And their buses don't look dramatically different either. There hasn't been any particularly fancy technological innovation that's behind this. But yes, it is about networking. It really is about knitting it together. And the idea is to try and make it like being a driver on the road system. It should be as easy to transfer from one bit of public transport to another as it is to turn off one road and onto another. The very best public transport operators in the world have come as close, I think, as anyone has to that this stage. Now, on the whole, in Australia, but even more so in New Zealand, particularly with the kind of fetish for competition as an end in itself rather than something that might be there for a purpose, we've put a lot of effort into doing the opposite, to disintegrating and discouraging people from transferring and people have responded rationally to that, I guess. There are obviously other things that apply as well. You need to have a single organisation in charge with the power to direct the providers, regardless of whether they're public or private, as to what to do. There has to be a pooling of the fare revenue so that people aren't undermining the integrity of the system by competing with each other on the profitable runs. There's a lot of stuff like that you need, but it's those things more, I think, than technology per se that are the key to really making public transport work.
We've got two last questions, just at the back there, then Dr Rothman at the front.
Yeah. I was just wondering, there's been a recent report on accessibility of public transport after the standards were introduced in Australia. How do you evaluate disabled people's ability to use public transport successfully?
Look, I don't know, to be honest. I have to concede that it's not really my area. We have a problem with that in Melbourne because we've got a lot of old trams that have high floors, and it would cost $2 or $3 billion to replace them with low-floored trams, and that's a fraught social issue about whether that's the most useful thing you can do with $2 or $3 billion. They had a big fight about it in Zurich because, although you may not have noticed it, their old trams aren't fully accessible either, but there was a proposal which they didn't go for, but the Swedish city of Gothenburg went to, where they added a low-floor section in the middle of the tram, and it meant people in wheelchairs didn't have the run of the whole vehicle, but they could at least get on and off. But I will concede that it's not really one of my special subjects, the question of how we deal with the challenge of accessibility. But it does raise that tension between the very high cost of new equipment versus the goal of universal accessibility. Happily, of course, in most of New Zealand, in Christchurch, they have no rail system, so they don't have to worry about old vehicles, so they can design it in from day one. But if you're an existing tram system with lots of capital sunk in old vehicles, I think it's a fraught issue that I don't claim to have a magic answer to, I'm afraid.
Oh, yeah. I grew up in Austria, which is similar to Switzerland, and I lived in Australia and New Zealand. And one of the main cultural differences that struck me first, other than the really bad waste management that seemed to happen down here, is the fact that there seems to be a lot of secrecy in public transport as to where you're going and when you're supposed to get off. Like if somebody gives you an address, quite seriously, you literally, as any tourist speaking any language in Austria, Germany or Switzerland, you can't get lost on public transport. You know where you're going.
We don't want just anyone using public
transport.
Yeah.
But here,
it's a club.
If somebody gives you an address and says, come here, I didn't use the bus in Wellington for years because I was too scared that I was going to get lost. I mean, that is a very simple way of making public transport more accessible, it seems, but we're not doing it very well.
Oh, no, I think you're dead right. Let me just be a bit boring. You'll notice that the colour coding of the routes on the Schaffhausen timetable matches their colour coding on the little timetable book that the City Council hand out, and you'll see that the sign is very prominent, the route structure is very simple. So you're dead right. Funnily enough, the legibility, to use the jargon, of a public transport system to a tourist is often a very good way of testing whether it's actually being run properly or not, because a tourist can go to Schaffhausen and work out within very short time at all how to get from any A to any B anywhere in the city. It's one of the reasons, I think, why we tend to like light rail systems, because when we go to other places we can kind of work them out. We know they're not going to jump off the tracks and run around somewhere else because it's Tuesday and they're going past Sacred Heart College to pick up the kids after school. But it's a combination of how you present your information, but it's also to do with how you design your network, you see. Even in Zurich, where they have a lot of bus routes, they don't have anywhere near as many bus routes as Auckland has, yet they have 10 times as many passengers as Auckland has. So I think you not only, with this kind of approach, which the Austrians have now adopted on their national rail system as well, although I understand they copied it from the Swiss, but I wouldn't want to be between them when they're arguing about it. It enables you to not just make your network more efficient in terms of the resources you have to put in order to provide a service for people, but it also enables you to make it easier for people to understand. And if you don't make it easier for new users to understand, you might not get any new users and you might be stuck with the people you've got now, and eventually they die. So this is absolutely critically important, but it's a good test of how outward-looking and inward-looking a public transport system might be. And the great irony, of course, is that the thing that's most inimical to this kind of thing is precisely the obsession with competition and marketisation that Auckland represents an extreme example of, at least in its bus network. So we introduced competition in the free market because we thought it would be more innovative and customer-friendly, but in fact that's innovative and customer-friendly, and Casbah, Triva, Schaffhausen is a business unit of the Municipality of Schaffhausen. It's that old-fashioned. I'm not suggesting that it has to be organised like that, but they actually focused on fixing the problem directly rather than constantly fiddling around with marketisation arrangements that some theologian in an economics department reckon cause all the problems to go away.
Can we just show our appreciation to Paul again?